George Pataki this time around is, I think, doing a really good job. He's much better prepared than he was when he ran last time or tested the waters last time. And his speech, I think, was very effective, very statesmanlike. And from what people that I talked to that were covering it more closely said, compared with a lot of the other candidates that are coming through, he delivers a very good discussion of issues, very substantive, focused quite a bit on foreign policy and terrorism-related issues, which I think fits into a sweet spot for him as governor of New York. Most governors don't have the ability or the experience to talk about those things.
And how will those issues play with voters in New Hampshire?
Well, for the most part right now, voters in New Hampshire are interested in jobs and the economy. Even though our unemployment rate is improving here, we really haven't fully recovered from the past recession, and I think that's still the primary thing on the mind of voters.
He's been making a lot of trips to New Hampshire. Are people beginning to know who he is, and is he showing up on the radar?
Voters in New Hampshire are paying attention to Pataki. They know who he is. Unfortunately for Pataki, they don't really like him that much right now. Currently, among likely Republican primary voters, 22% have a favorable opinion of him, but 32% have an unfavorable opinion of him. So he's got a -10 net favorability rating. Only Donald Trump has a lower net favorability rating.
What do you think it is that they don't like?
I'm not really sure, because it's not that as if he had any real baggage associated with him. I really couldn't tell you what it is or why that impression is there. That said, he's up to about 2% in the polls in the horse race question. Now, 2% seems like you're barely registering, but the truth is, Jeb Bush, who was leading in our last poll, was only at 15%. So this is a wide open race, and I think that's a reason why you see governors like Pataki or a Bobby Jindal, who aren't well known particularly and don't have an issue really that they can drive other than maybe their experience. They're getting into this race because they figure that if there's an opportunity to win the presidency, this is as good a year as any for a Republican.
And Pataki's strategy, it seems, is to put all his eggs in one basket here in New Hampshire, try to appeal to the voters here, do very well if possible in the first presidential primary, where you have not only Republicans voting, but independents who may favor a more moderate like Pataki.
One of the things that we see in New Hampshire is about 45% of likely Republican primary voters identify themselves as either moderate or liberal. So this is not a conservative state or with a conservative Republican electorate like you would see in certainly Iowa, but even South Carolina. So more moderate voters or more mainstream traditional Republicans tend to do quite well. Mitt Romney, obviously, in 2012, John McCain in 2008 and 2000. So that's the typical kind of voter that Northeast Republicans tend to do well in this state. Candidates that emphasize social issues don't do well. And I think that Pataki has the kind of the package of social issues that fit pretty well with Republicans in New Hampshire. On the issue of abortion, for example, likely Republican primary voters are more pro-choice than the entire country is. So a pro-choice Republican actually fits in pretty well with those Republicans. The same is true with issues like gay marriage. Republicans aren't really in favor of it here, but they're not really that opposed to it. They're more indifferent than anything. So the social issues that will play to the voters in Iowa and even in South Carolina really don't play here. So a moderate Republican like a Pataki or a Jeb Bush or Chris Christie are going to focus on New Hampshire, probably play down the other early states.
For Pataki, he talks about retail politics and how he thinks that's going to help him, getting out, meeting the voters, shaking the hands, of course, what New Hampshire is famous for, where many of the people say they want to size up their candidates, meet them in person, talk with them. Will that help him? You mentioned just a few moments ago that so far his negatives are higher than his positives. Will retail politics help him?
Well, it certainly can't hurt him, and I think that's really the thing he has to do. Right now, we've got a lot of candidates that aren't that well known. The only two that are really, the candidates that are bumping up right now, Marco Rubio, Jeb Bush, Donald Trump, and Scott Walker a little bit, but the other candidates aren't particularly well known. So he's got an opportunity to make a name for himself by meeting with people one-on-one. The other thing that coming to the state and doing retail campaigning does is it allows him to drive more media coverage and press coverage. So people will read more about him. More of their friends might hear him, and then they'll get to hear from them directly. So the retail, I don't want to overemphasize the importance of retail politicking in New Hampshire, because most voters here don't actually meet a candidate. But of those who do, meeting somebody face to face is a very important thing. And it's the buzz that you get built when you're doing the retail politicking. John McCain did the same thing back in 2000. He started off way behind George Bush and Elizabeth Dole in 2000, in 1999, but really campaigned here and created a buzz not only among voters, but among the press, that this is a guy that's straightforward, that is willing to answer any question that is thrown to him and substantively be able to answer them. So if Pataki can do that, he could do pretty well. And the other thing about doing the retail politicking is that you become a better candidate yourself. You get to focus your message, you understand the language that voters are using, you truly understand the concerns that voters have, and that's something that you just can't get if you're out of the state, not talking with people and relying on focus groups or polls to drive your campaign.
With such a crowded field, though, already several candidates nearing 10, maybe as many as 20 Republicans before all is said and done. Are those just too many other choices that many people would look at before George Pataki? Are his odds really long?
I'd say his odds aren't good right now. There are a lot of other candidates that are better known and better liked, and they're also getting more media attention. I think Pataki's twofold goals are I think Pataki's two challenges are, first, to raise money. He needs to be able to come up with the resources that allows him to campaign in New Hampshire as well as other states. But he really needs to raise his visibility in the state. And I think he'll have to do that by one-on-one campaigning. He has an advantage of living close by, so he can get here quite easily. And he has the advantage of not currently holding office, so he doesn't have other obligations, elected official obligations that he has to hold to.
A lot of people point to that and say that may hurt him, that he hasn't been in politics for 10 years. He'll say that I've been in the private sector for 10 years and that experience is going to help me.
Well, certainly the way you spin that is the mark of a good candidate, but private sector experience with Republicans is always an advantage, and the more he can emphasize his private sector skills, I think the better off he'll be.
Does he need to make that magic number 10 cutoff? Fox is holding the first presidential debate coming up in August. If he isn't one of those 10 Republicans on stage, does that really hurt his chances?
I think any candidate that's not on that stage in August will be hurt somewhat. I wouldn't say that it's a death blow to any candidate. The problem is there are so many candidates, there are going to be a lot of good candidates that are left off that stage. And I would argue that relying on national polls to determine who is invited to that debate is the wrong thing to do, because there is not a national primary electorate. There's not a national campaign going on. There are campaigns essentially going on in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. So I would pay much more attention to polling in those states in inviting the candidates. Well, remains to be seen whether that's what Fox wants to do. It's certainly probably not what the National Republican Party wants to do. They want to limit this and get it over as quickly as possible.
If George Pataki comes within the top 3 or 4 in New Hampshire, say the top 3, does he then go on? Is that what he needs to accomplish here to move on?
I think the top 3 candidates from New Hampshire do go on to South Carolina. It's a winnowing process. Typically, Iowa winnows out the most conservative candidates, and you have 1, maybe 2 conservative candidates lasting after Iowa. New Hampshire tends to identify the front-running, moderate, mainstream Republican, and then you get into South Carolina, which really is a test to narrow that down. After South Carolina, things go very, very fast, and it becomes a contest of which candidate has the most resources to compete in multiple states. So what Pataki would have to do is do well enough in New Hampshire to make sure that he is a major candidate in South Carolina. And if he can do well in South Carolina and attract funding, which is key, attract funding to be able to go into those Super Tuesday states.